I'm just going to turn it on. And I have a zillion tapes, so...
So we can launch right into it if you want. I'll just hide the food here.
Well, he looks skinny on this picture.
Yeah. Well, he was quite different. When he started out, he's a good advertisement for the Center for Living and for not eating his own products, his own hamburgers.
Now, does he live down here, or
No,
he would fly down here and do that?
Yeah.
What do you want to do with this one? You want to split it? You want more?
I don't want any more. No,
you
but
don't
you
want
eat it. Yeah. Just hide it from view from me. His history, interesting. He was born, I think, in Georgia. He was an orphan. And in those early days, Duke used to lend out books to poorer kids from the library free of charge. And so he used to borrow books from the Duke Library by mail. And he never forgot that, can you imagine? And as he made his fortune, he gave most of it to Duke because of what they did for him.
Interesting, I was reading a similar article about, I think it was Hewlett in Stanford. Because when Hewlett graduated from Stanford, Stanford was still what they called a fledgling university, where it didn't really have that much respect, didn't have that much, there's no Silicon Valley or anything like that. And it was talking about how Hewlett, throughout Hewlett-Packard's success, he went back and he gave them the money to build the engineering building and basically helped Silicon Valley to grow and the university to grow. So
I think it may be we sent you that article on the relationship between Hewlett and Packard.
Yeah, you sent us one.
There was a picture of the two of them, and I think we made the comment that this is a replica of you and Ken, because one of them had certain characteristics and the other had other characteristics, and it corresponded to you and Ken pretty much. And there was a picture of the two of them. The other articles may have appeared, but I know we sent you one on it. Well, shall we start now, or don't you want to wait?
Well,
let's
just finish this.
Finish that. It's interesting. I added Tylenol. It's a standard thing to the drug I take. And it made all the difference in the world. The pain more or less disappeared just by adding Tylenol. I did it without the doctor's permission, but I'm going to see her on Monday and find out. But it hasn't helped my walking any because my knees are still quite weak, but I don't have the pain that I had. So I went out this morning and ran a few errands.
I thought you were going to say ran a few miles.
No, I wish I could. The stair business will be put in on Easter Monday, the Monday after Easter. Did I show you a picture of it or not? Yeah, I did.
I was here when they were measuring for it.
Yeah, well, that's right. So the date is definite, Easter Monday. The electrician comes tomorrow to install the outlet for it. Competition is interesting. I had the three companies, and one company I didn't like at all, so I discarded them. Second company was $270 less than this company. So when I called this company, they said, how do we stack up? I said, well, you're $270 more than your competitor. He said, hold on a minute. He went and talked to his boss and came back and said, we'll match it. Bring our price down 270. So competition is an interesting thing, isn't it?
I guess that's not that significant in relation to the cost of it.
Yeah.
It's just sort of surprised the quotes were that similar.
Yeah, they were, right?
Alright, let me just get rid of this stuff.
What have you got in that mug there?
Dr. Pepper.
Oh, yeah.
Just a soda.
I like Dr. Pepper. I like it better than Coke.
I had a long period of time when I wouldn't drink this. And I
Same
just
with me.
sort of, somehow I've just relaxed a little bit. I should get back into the swing of not drinking sodas, but there's so many restaurants where they only have fountain drink types of drinks, and so
I've gone back to drinking tonic water, quinine water, because I read someplace that it's very good for you. The quinine, a little bit of quinine in the water, is nevertheless very beneficial. So since I like it anyhow, I've always liked it. Whenever I went to parties, instead of having a scotch and soda, I'd always ask for tonic water. So I'm drinking it again now. I just bought a supply of it.
so yeah, I'll have a gin and tonic. Hold the gin.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Well, I'm ready.
All right. Well, I got it on here, so. All right. So should we finish up like what we were talking about last time with your
Yes,
parents?
Mike, we were talking about my parents and so on. I want to finish that up. There's several observations to be made. I'm still back in my grandfather's house, and in that horseshoe turn where about 10 families lived, immigrant families, all from either Czechoslovakia or Italy. 4 families from Italy and about 7 from Czechoslovakia. So far as I can determine now, they must have come from the Czech part of Czechoslovakia because they were Lutheran, and they established a Lutheran church in Danbury, which was called the St. Paul's Slavic Lutheran Church. But as a boy, I observed several things because I played with the other boys in the area and we were good friends. One was that the Czechs were extremely athletically inclined. The first thing they did was to build what they called the so-called gymnasium. And they used to go down every afternoon to practice all kinds of acrobatics and wrestling and so on in the so-called gym. None of the other immigrant communities did that. The other immigrant communities would build lodges of some kind or meeting halls, but not gymnasiums. But the Czechs built a gymnasium. The second thing I observed about the Czechs, which made a lasting impression on me, was their alcoholism. Of all the families there, most of them had alcoholic fathers, and how they made a living I don't know. Usually the wives worked, they took in laundry, the daughters worked, and the husbands were, I'm sorry to say, more or less no-goods. They came home staggering and yelling. I used to be aware of that even when I was 10 years old. And it made a very deep impression on me, the effects of alcoholism. None of the Italian immigrants ever got drunk because they never drank hard liquor. They drank wine at meals and that was it. But that was all. The other observation I made about the Czech immigrants in those days in the 1890s used to come in pairs. Brothers would come together. Sometimes the brothers were married to sisters. And that was the case of some of our Czechs in that area. And I noticed the difference. For example, there was one family where the father was absolutely no good. He was an alcoholic. His brother, on the other hand, was extremely successful, had a great big farm, a beautiful farm, where he raised vegetables, and it was on hills in Connecticut, and we used to go tobogganing on the hills of that farm. He was extremely successful, the brother was not. There was another family where the same thing applied. The brother was again more or less no good, but his brother was quite successful. His children went to college, whereas the children of the first brother did not go to college. So there was this difference. The two brothers came, equal circumstances. They arrived brand new in this country, had the same opportunities. One was successful and one was not. And I observed that as a young kid. And I saw the value of hard work and discipline and so on, which the successful families applied and the other ones did not. So there's that observation to be made. The other is kind of the extended family of my grandparents, which was quite interesting to me. My grandfather had no brothers, but he had a sister who had married to someone by the name of Scappa, S-C-O-P-P-A. But that both his sister died and her husband died, and they left behind 5 or 6 children at a very young age. Those children had no place to go, so to some extent they were taken care of by my grandfather. He was their uncle. They lived in New York, but sometimes they would come and spend a year with my grandfather and go to school in Danbury, Connecticut. I call these the New York relatives. They were all New Yorkers. They all became quite successful, and I grew to resent them. The name of all of them was Scappa. There were several brothers. One was the principal of a school in the Bronx, New York, which was the Admiral David G. Farragut Junior High School, and he was the principal, so he was well educated. He had a very charming wife, whose mother was German, actually, and they had 3 children. They would come to visit. They were rather pleasant. They had 2 very attractive daughters who were my second cousins, and when they came on weekends we used to play and so on. And I visited them. They lived in Scarsdale, which was a kind of dormitory community for New York City, and I stayed with them for a couple of days in Scarsdale and visiting his school. They were not so bad. Then there was a sister whose name was Adelaide, who married someone by the name of Nicolosi. And he was an interesting man. He was a fur cutter. I had never known much about fur cutters, but apparently people who cut fur coats and fit the furs together to make perfect fits in fur coats are very highly paid in New York. So he was quite wealthy. And they used to come to visit in a car. I don't know whether that means anything to you, Michael, but a Cord was ranked probably next to the Duesenberg in those days. It was an absolutely magnificent car and cost a small fortune. So they came in a Cord. And I remember as a kid walking around that Cord and feeling the tires and feeling the radiator, and a beautiful chrome radiator, and admiring it generally. And they'd take me for a ride in it. They were quite impossible. They would come on weekends. Adelaide, the aunt, or the niece of my grandfather, was a domineering, grande dame type. A big woman, constantly talking, constantly jabbering, constantly criticizing. Her husband was quite small. They came on weekends. Then there were 2 other brothers, also with children, and they would come. The net result was that almost every weekend my poor grandmother had these relatives from New York who came, sponging on her, so to speak, while she, the poor woman, spent all of her time in the kitchen baking and cooking for them, because she was a wonderful cook. Her food was wonderful. They came from New York just to kind of spend a weekend in the country, free of charge. They were quite supercilious. They looked down upon us as kind of the country cousins, whereas they came from the city. They had this awful New York accent, Bronx accent, which even as a kid I disliked. And they used to call me Kid. Hey, Kid, they'd say, which I resented. Hey, Kid, what are you doing, Kid? Hey, Kid, here's a $50 toward your Boy Scout hat, and so on. And I got to dislike them, even as a young boy. And I felt terribly sorry for my grandmother, because she would slave all weekend when they came down, you see. And however, one of them, as I say, these were all men. They were nephews of my grandfather. But one of them was a niece whose name was Angie. She married a wealthy man whose name was Markey. They lived in Long Island. And they would come in a chauffeur-driven car. They were also quite wealthy. Well, he died, and Angie was left alone, but she was an angel. She was a wonderful, wonderful woman. She was totally unlike these brothers of hers. First of all, she had helped bring up these brothers when they weren't with my grandfather. And then after her husband died, she worked, and she had a small apartment in the Bronx. She would come on the train on Sunday. She'd bring presents for my grandmother. She would walk to church. She'd go back on the train, no matter how old she was. She would help my grandmother. She would give them some money and so on. And she was just wonderful. So wonderful that when I went to Columbia University in New York City, I lived with her in her small apartment in the Bronx. And she put up a sheet kind of separating her living room so that I could sleep in one end and she could sleep in the other. She at that time was nearly 70 years old. But she was a wonderful, wonderful woman as compared to these brothers whom I thought were quite obnoxious and quite supercilious, and I thought quite inconsiderate of my poor grandmother who had to work. Recently I was going over the poems of your great-grandfather, Dr. Kaufman, and I'm not going to read this poem, but there was a wonderful poem in here called The Country Wife, in which he makes the same theme about the poor country woman on the farm. 70 were the years she lived, no thought of women's rights. Her back was bent, she used her muscle courage much, but saved her pity for the city girls and such. And he goes on to say how the city girls would come to visit the poor country wife, and the city girls would eat all the wonderful food which the country wife made, and then they'd go back. But nevertheless, in their hearts they realized that the country wife, with her bent back, was much better off than the glamorous city girls. And I thought, when I read this poem, I thought of that experience which I had as a child with these New York relatives who came. There was one other relative who was interesting and worthy of note. Now, first of all, let me say before going on to the other relatives, all these relatives who were nephews and the one niece came, and they asked always my grandfather's advice. He was more or less their father. And while he didn't know much about some of their work, some of them were engaged in the stock market and so on, and made their money that way, and the principal of the school and the like. The others, by the way, were in the movie business, which was then thriving in New York City. They would bring me what they said were autographed pictures of the actresses and actresses of the time, Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford and so on. I don't know whether they were authentic or not, but they'd bring the pictures. So my grandfather didn't know much about what was going on, but nevertheless he gave them advice on family matters and the like. Then there was another relative who was interesting, and that was my grandmother's brother. It was the only relative she had. This was Uncle William, as we called him, though in reality he was a cousin. Uncle William lived in New Haven, and Uncle William would come, not so often, maybe once every 3 or 4 months, something like that. And Uncle William kind of looked like an American Indian. He had a big nose, if there is such a thing as an Indian nose, but a sort of hawkish nose, a kind of a swarthy complexion. He was really quite handsome. And he didn't do any kind of regular work. He just moved around from one job to another. He was this kind of man, though he made money. How he made it, only God knows. But among his other jobs, he was an Indian chief, outselling snake oil. And his name was Chief Two Moon. Well, as a young boy, I didn't know anything about the snake oil business. And I thought he was a real Indian chief. So he called himself Chief Two Moon when he came. He called me, thank goodness he didn't call me kid. He was much more polite. So he called me by my name, and he'd call me over and he'd, you know, I'm Chief Two Moon. You'll have to come to my house in New Haven and see my tomahawk. Well, I thought that was terrific, because in those days, as young kids, we used to play cowboy and Indian. And I had a cowboy outfit, and I had an Indian outfit, and I have a picture in our picture album someplace of how I lassoed my sister and tied her to a tree and danced around her like an Indian. This was a common pastime for young kids at the time. So I was tremendously impressed by this Chief Two Moon, and I used to tell all my friends that my uncle, as I called him, though as I say he was only a second cousin, You know, my uncle is a Chief Two Moon. They had to see Chief Two Moon. So when he came, I'd run around the neighborhood saying, my uncle is here, Chief Two Moon. And they would run up to the house to see Chief, get him to come out of the house so they could see him. Well, we visited him in New Haven one time, and sure enough, in his sunroom, he lived in a very fine house in New Haven, and he had a tomahawk and Indian headdress and wampum and so on the wall, which again convinced me that he was really Chief Two Moon. Well, my grandfather couldn't stand him. This, after all, was his brother-in-law. My grandfather was a very honest, straight man, and he would have none of this kind of thing. And my grandfather was a man who worked hard all of his life and was as honest as could be. And he never liked this brother-in-law of his. He always suspected that he was engaged in all kinds of shady deals. How else did he get his money when obviously he didn't do any work? So every time Chief Two Moon would come and be in the house, my grandfather would go out and work in the garden. He didn't want anything to do with it. So my grandfather, Chief Two Moon, he'd say, in effect, like heck, he's Chief Two Moon. And he's nothing but a big crook. So somehow, he made his money. He was in politics somehow, I think in some kind of, I don't know what kind of machinations in politics, but anyhow, he made money without working. And my grandfather was always suspicious of him, because here my poor grandfather had to work so hard for every cent he had. So that takes care of what I call the New York relatives who came down. Some of the New York relatives, some of the aspects of those relatives was very interesting. The Scapa, the Jake Scapa part, the man who was the principal of a school, they were quite remarkable. He not only was principal of a school, but he wrote a series of history books on American history. He was a devout Roman Catholic, and this series of history books sought to show the Catholic influence in the founding of America, from Lord Baltimore of Maryland, who was the first great Roman Catholic, and so on, and Amerigo Vespucci, Columbus, and so on, and other people whom he brought out. So he was quite a scholar in his own way. But most remarkable, his wife, who was a very beautiful woman, and who was very German in appearance, if there is such a thing as being German in appearance, but she was very light and quite handsome. She was the daughter of a man whose name was Frank Shortino. Shortino was married to a German, again a very handsome woman, and he had worked with Marconi, the inventor of the radio. And so he was a radio specialist in the early days. And one of the things which, he was a very wonderful man when he came. That branch of the relatives were not like the others. This branch was very good and very interesting. And when he would come only occasionally, he would talk about his work with the radio. Very advanced, of course, because in those days, the radios, we still were using automobile batteries to power radios. And when we had radios in our houses, you'd see automobile batteries sitting on newspaper on the floor with all kinds of coiled wires going up to the set and then to a speaker, which was a great big horn. He made for my grandfather a radio. He made it himself. And he made the most beautiful speaker. I can remember that speaker now. It was a round speaker. Not a horn type, but just a round speaker made of a kind of canvas. And on that canvas was a painting of a ship. And so it was a work of art. And my grandfather had that speaker in his living room with the radio and with the batteries. Later the batteries were taken away and you could plug the radio into an electrical circuit, but in the early days you used batteries. And that was the most beautiful speaker I'd ever seen. I don't know what's ever happened to it, to that speaker in the radio, but I've never forgotten that man talking about the invention of radio and how important it was and so on, because at that time radio was something brand new to us. So that covers then the Braibanti family, a family of some prestige in that neighborhood, as I said, a family with 2 cars a two-car garage, and nobody else had one in the area. And so I'm very proud of them. To move on to my mother's family, as I indicated earlier, my other grandfather was quite the opposite. Also a very good man, but a man who was widowed very early in life, so lived alone, thought nothing about his clothes, thought nothing about the house, did not have a garden, lived very simply in a four-room apartment, taking in money from his rents, and he would lend out money for mortgages and so on, and accumulate more money. He somehow had an obsession with accumulating money and living very simply himself. He would spend no money on himself. He had a brother who at first lived in one of his apartments, but then bought a house next door. The brother was younger. His name was John. His name was, well, my grandfather's name was John. The brother's name I can't remember right now. But anyhow, they both worked in the Mallory Hat Company as finishers. They both made pretty good money. They didn't know what a vacation was. They worked half a day on Saturday. Their only recreation, I think I indicated last time, was walking down to a pub on Ives Street, across the street from the firehouse in Danbury, every Saturday night, having a couple of mugs of beer and walking back. No indication of drunkenness of any kind, no hard liquor, none in the house. They didn't even keep beer in the house, but they would just go down, drink a mug or two of beer on Saturday and come back, and that was it. Then on Sunday morning, they would spend all morning in church, attending one mass after another, and that was their recreation. He was a very good man, as I indicated. I sometimes stayed with him at night, sometimes spent a weekend with him, helped him do some work around the house, painted the porch floors, washed the kitchen floor, waxed it. He paid me $1 for that. But the interesting thing about him was the relationship he had to his children. He had one son whose name was Edward, and 3 daughters, of whom my mother was one. His obsession in life was to educate that son. So he sent the son to private school and then to dental school, where he became a dentist. The daughters all left school at 6th grade or 7th grade or 8th grade and worked in a silk mill and then got married, my mother being the first to be married. But everything was concentrated on that son, and he spent any amount of money on the son. And the son lived with him. Even after he became a dentist, he lived in that tiny apartment. And the devotion between the son and the father, it was a mixture of devotion and a kind of almost obsessive possession which my grandfather had over his son, whereby the son, even after he became a dentist, lived in that tiny apartment, and after he got married to a very fine woman who lived in a luxurious apartment in New York, she came to Danbury and she had to live with my grandfather in this tiny, rather squalid apartment. I don't know how she could stand it. But such was the relationship between the father and the son, that son dared not do anything which was objectionable to his father. And his father insisted that he live there with him. And so he did, over the objections to his wife. Well, eventually the wife won out, and they bought a very fine home in the best part of Danbury and lived there and left my grandfather alone. But that was a very peculiar relationship. The son was a very good man who was particularly attached to me because I was the first boy in the family, the first nephew, and he used to bring me gifts. Even when he was in dental school, he would come home with a gift. I remember one gift was an electric train. He brought me a Lionel electric train, which was very nice of him. Another time he bought me what was called a Barney Google. in those days, one of the comic strips was Barney Google and a horse. And so you had models of a horse and a Barney Google, and he bought me that. Later on, when I was a little bit older and I wanted to have a chemistry set for Christmas, I was set on a chemistry set, but my parents couldn't afford it. He got his sisters and brothers-in-law to chip in, and they all bought me the chemistry set, and he did that. He was very close to my mother and my father. I remember when he came home from dental school with his drilling apparatus. In the days before an electric drill, you had a pedal, and you pressed on the pedal and it turned a wheel, and that wheel turned the drill, and that's how you drilled teeth. And he used to show us how it operated. He was a very successful dentist, and he practiced dentistry until he was 80 years of age. And he was like his father in a way. He invested in property. He bought other houses that had apartments. He bought houses on a new development at Lake Candlewood. So when he died, he owned quite a bit of property. But he also invested his money very wisely. He handled the money after his father's death, so that Uncle Eddie, as we called him, was able then to see to it that the money was properly distributed among the sisters, and so on. He was a very good man. Once I learned to drive, I was his chauffeur in many ways. We'd go out, I drove him to Boston. First time I ever stayed in a hotel was in Boston, when I drove him to a dental convention, the Copley Plaza, which is still there. And I would drive him other places. He was a member of the Moose Lodge, which is interesting. He eventually became state governor of the Moose Lodge. And the Moose had its own tavern. You must remember that in places in New England and in Connecticut and Danbury, there were taverns, which you would call pubs elsewhere. There was no such thing as dry laws in that area of the country as there was in North Carolina. So he liked to drink. He didn't get drunk, but he liked to drink. And he would go to pubs, and I would have to the Moose Pub, and I would have to go with him to the Moose Pub. Now there enters my other feeling with respect to alcohol. In that Moose Pub, if you can picture or imagine 20, 30 men, all smoking, all jabbering, all drinking beer, no air conditioning, and the combined stench of beer and smoke and cigarette smoke used to repel me. And I think that, more than anything else, led me against any kind of smoking, though I've never smoked in my life. I've never even had a cigarette in my mouth. But the smell of the beer and the cigarette tobacco was really too much for me, so I used to detest that. But anyhow, that's what he did. The other sisters, my mother's sisters, there were 3 of them, also married people who were in the hatting industry, except one who married someone who owned a men's clothing store, for whom I worked during Christmas vacations and so on, selling suits and neckties and shirts and the like. And they were all very good people, and they all produced people who were my first cousins, all of whom are either dentists or doctors or teachers, all well-educated people. Some now retired in Florida, and I'm in contact with them quite often. So that takes care of that part of the family. That grandfather. No, there is one other aspect, where, as I indicated last time, my grandfather Braibanti would have nothing to do with the church. He disliked the church. He was buried in the church, of course, but he disliked it, and he never went to church. My Polish grandfather, on the other hand, was devoted to the church. It was his life. He gave quite a bit of money to it. And there was very nice religious celebrations at Christmas, and I remember one of them, for example. At Christmas, we would all gather together at his house, and around the big kitchen table, under the tablecloth, they would put straw, which apparently was a custom of Central Europe at the time. Straw under the tablecloth, symbolizing the manger of Christ, and then these wafers, just like the communion wafers in the Catholic Church, which we would dip in honey, and break and eat all around the table, and then sing a Christmas carol. That was very nice. It was a very nice custom. We had no such customs on the Braibanti side, none whatever. There must have been customs in Italy, but they were either forgotten or deliberately neglected, so we never had such a thing. But there were these religious ceremonies. At Easter, for example, the priest would come to the house and he would write over the mantle of the door the initials of the three wise men. Now, why he did it at Easter, I don't know, since the three wise men are associated with Christmas rather than Easter. But anyhow, he did that, and then he would bless the house. So there was much of that religious activity which went on. Our society was oriented more toward my mother's side of the family, because her only friends were her sisters. So we were always going on picnics together. One uncle, the one who owned the clothing store, loved fishing. I'd sometimes go fishing with him over across the line in New York State. Some of the lakes in New York, of which there were many. We were only, after all, about 10 miles from New York, from the New York border. So we'd go over into New York to fish. But our society was almost totally oriented toward that side of the family, with one exception. And that is, on my grandfather's side, my grandfather had a daughter, in other words, the sister of my father, who had 8 children, 6 girls and 2 boys. I'm sorry, the opposite, 6 boys and 2 girls. And I used to play with those boys. They lived in an area where there were sand dunes, interesting enough, or what's called a gravel pit. But in reality it was sand. And in it was a natural spring with a pond. So we used to go there, and I never did swim, but I'd wade around in the water and splash around and so on. And I would play with those cousins. Boxing was a very popular thing, and we'd listen to boxing on the radio. Primo Canera and the other great boxers of the time. And it was so popular that my father bought me boxing gloves. Although I was never much of a boxer, and I used to box with my cousins, but my cousins always won, because they were very tough, and I was not. But anyhow, I tried my best with the boxing gloves, and later on I hung them up, so to speak, and didn't do any more boxing. But boxing was a great thing, and my father, and it was one of his recreations, was listening to the boxing matches at night on the radio. So that takes care pretty much of the families, the 2 families, and their characteristics. But as I look back, because after all we lived through the Depression, and I well remember, so that you didn't know one day to the next whether you were going to, literally, whether you were going to work the next day. And I remember my father or my grandfather coming home, and my grandmother would ask, "How was it today?" And they'd say, "Well, we didn't make very much money. We had what we call very tough hats to do. And since they were paid by the piece, they were paid not by the hour, but by each hat which they did. If they had hats which were particularly difficult, then they couldn't do as many hats, and so they would make less money. And the management never made an adjustment between the difficult hats and the easy hats. It was the same for each hat, no matter whether it was easy or difficult. This is how the management made fortunes, and the poor workers didn't make very much. It was a kind of exploitation of the workers, there's no doubt about it. I saw both sides of it because I saw how the workers were exploited. Then when my father owned a factory, I saw the difficulties involved with respect to owning a factory and managing a factory. Those difficulties were enormous. So my views gradually began to change from siding with labor. I began to see the management side also, and while I didn't side with management, I saw their problems as well, and so my attitude toward the labor-management dichotomy was somewhat mellowed. So much then for that particular time. Now to move on, as I say, we moved then into a separate house on Davis Street, which was a very nice area, and I think I pointed out before. The first selectman of the city lived across the street. Indeed, I flirted with his daughter for a while, but only a kind of mild flirtation. The tax collector lived there, immediately across the street, and immediately across the street from us, that is more immediately, was a wonderful family, the Davis family, and a woman whose name was Martha King Davis. As it turned out, she was Lucy's Sunday school teacher in the Congregational Church, though of course as a young kid I had no knowledge that that would ever come to pass. But I used to cut their lawn for 75 cents. Oh, it was killing work because it was all banks, very steep banks. And I had to use my own lawnmower, which was not a power lawnmower, and then I had to trim with scissors on my hands and knees all around the sidewalks. Well, I got 75 cents for that, which was quite good in those days. And it was in the summer. She'd come out and bring me a wonderful glass of ice-cold root beer, homemade root beer. You must remember that in those days we made our own root beer. Every family made root beer, including ours. We bought the yeast, we had the bottles, we had a capper. I used to cap the bottles and so on. And the homemade root beer was delicious, much better than any root beer you can buy today. So as I was sweating in the heat with all that hard work, she'd bring me out that glass of root beer. Well, she developed a liking for me. They had no son of their own. She was a writer, an author. She wrote short stories. She was a wonderful, wonderful woman. And taking me under her wing, she would give me books and recommend books for me to read. And I'll never forget, she recommended George Santayana's The Last Puritan, which is a classic work. She recommended to me Georges Duhamel's book, The Pasquier Chronicles. You probably have never heard of them, but they were both great books, and I bought them eventually. And she constantly recommending books to me. So she was a marvelous influence in my life. The husband, Howard Davis, who ran an insurance company and was also, as it turned out, a friend of Dr. Kaufman's, but again, I knew nothing about this at that early age. He took a liking to me, and he was a stamp collector, and so was I. I loved to collect stamps. And he took me to New York, my first trip to New York on the train, which was only 50 minutes away by train. He took me to New York to the Philatelic exhibition held at Grand Central Station. First time I'd been to a stamp exhibit, first time I'd been to New York. And he took me there on the train, took me under his wing, and I've never forgotten that. And they were very good to me throughout the time that they were living just across the street. I was very sensitive about things like this. Next door to the Davises lived, as I say, the first selectman. His name was Harkness. The houses were very close together, and there wasn't much lawn. But Mr. Harkness died, and I remember I felt so sorry for her as a widow that I used to cut her lawn free of charge. While I was doing the Davis lawn, I'd just go over and I'd cut the Harkness lawn, which was just almost like the same lawn, free of charge, and she liked that very much. By then, of course, I was in junior high school and walked to school. It was about a 2-mile walk to the junior high school where we had 7th and 8th grades, now called middle school. I loved school. I loved every minute of my school life, from kindergarten on to a PhD. I remember the names of all of my teachers. I can give you the first names from the kindergarten teacher to my graduate professors, although I can't tell you what the date was yesterday, but nevertheless I can tell you the names of every one of the teachers, including the first names. And I was a good student, except in arithmetic. I was always bad in arithmetic. And I remember one of my wonderful teachers, Miss Walsh, saying in the 6th grade to me, "Oh, if only you could be as good in arithmetic as you are in your other subjects." But alas, I never was as good in arithmetic as in everything else. But in everything else I excelled, especially in English and history and in writing and spelling and so on. And I was very good. I was a Boy Scout. I never got beyond second class, but I enjoyed being a Boy Scout. And I was a leader of a patrol, the Eagle Patrol, and I used to have meetings of the Eagle Patrol. I'd hoist my patrol flag, which had a picture of an eagle on it, on a bamboo pole in the lawn of my house, and I'd have the meetings in our basement. As I told you, our basement was, I think, 18 feet high, so you could do lots of things there. And I'd drill them. I'd have them march outside and march inside, much as you and I used to drill downstairs in the basement and so on, except I had 10 or 15 boys and I'd drill them. And my neighbor, who was very kindly, used to call me Sarge after that. He'd say, "Sarge, are you having your drill this week?" So on. So we had a good time. I had a picture machine. I sold ointment in a can for 25 cents a can, and by selling so many cans, I won a picture machine with a hand crank. And so I put up a sheet in the basement, and I had a couple of films of Mickey Mouse and Crazy Cat. West Point on Parade was a favorite one, and Wild Africa, the animals of Wild Africa. And it was a machine that you cranked like this, and it broke down every now and then. So I'd show the movies. I'd charge 10 cents, and I'd make maybe 50, 60 cents by showing the movies, and that was good. And so we had lots of fun. There were the house next door to us. There were twins, 2 twins, and we were good friends together, and we had all kinds of escapades and all kinds of mischief, as boys usually do. We had a circus. We sponsored a circus because they had a tent, and we had a circus parade with carts and bicycles up and down the street with signs advertising our circus and so on. And we had huts in the woods, and we had our secret huts and our secret society in the woods. The Boy Scouts I stayed into only until I was a second class, because then the scoutmaster left and the troop disbanded for a while, and so I quit and didn't go any further than that. I can't think of anything else with respect to the 2 years I spent in junior high school. Movies came in, talking movies came in at the time. I remember my mother taking me to a matinee at the Palace Theater to see the first talking movie that ever came out, featuring Al Jolson. And I remember one of the famous songs in it was "Climb Upon My Knees, Sonny Boy." And she took me to that. And one of the scenes in the movie was the death of the mother. And a very sad song about the death of the mother. That affected me very deeply, the idea of death and the death of one's mother. Another movie which I saw, one of the first talkies, was Eric Mariah Remarque's famous movie, All Quiet on the Western Front, about the First World War, from a German point of view. And that final scene in which the soldier reaches out from the trench because there's a butterfly just beyond the trench, and he reaches out through a kind of trench window, as it were, opening or aperture, to grasp that butterfly. And as he reaches out to grasp it, his hand falls. He's dead, shot dead. That influenced me greatly with respect to war. And I think at that moment, when I saw the movie All Quiet on the Western Front, and later read the famous book by Eric Mariah Remarque, I think at that point I became a pacifist and hated the thought of war and hated the thought of weapons, even though I had a cap pistol as a boy. But that didn't mean anything. I hated weapons, hated guns all of my life, for that matter. But those 2 movies which my mother took me to see in the afternoon were very great influences. Otherwise, we went to the movies on Saturday matinee, to see Western thrillers, which were continued. They were called cliff breakers, or cliffhangers rather. There was always somebody hanging on the cliff when it ended, and then you'd have to come back next Saturday to see what happened. Or there was a girl lying on the railroad tracks, and the train was rushing down, and she was tied to the tracks, and then it ended, and you had to come back next Saturday to see what happened. These were the famous Saturday matinees that all the kids attended. And I remember taking a girl from junior high school on a date. We had dates in those days, and this was Priscilla Ives, who turned out to be a relative of the Charles Ives who's mentioned in this book, actually. And I thought Priscilla, she was a musician. She played the piano. And I thought she was a very charming girl, not particularly attractive, but somehow she had a certain kind of charm. So a date in those days meant meeting her in front of the movie theater. So I'll meet you in front of the Palace. So we'd meet in front of the Palace, and I very proudly would buy her ticket for 10 cents, showing that I was a big shot, and maybe buy a bar of candy, usually a box of peppermints, and we'd go in and would see the movie. And that was that. And, so that was the way that we had social relations at that time. Can you think of any questions you want to ask me at this point now? We're up to junior high school, 7th and 8th grade.
I was curious. Well, I guess there are a couple of things that would be interesting to me. Well, the first question that I was wondering is, you had mentioned that there was a Miss Davis, and there were various people who would recommend books or maybe loan you books and things like that. But you also mentioned that you didn't last time that you didn't necessarily get, full support. That son, you will go to college and you will get this degree, and it's just interesting to me to know if there are influences that pushed you in the direction of completing your education, getting your PhD, and understood and supported that, versus maybe the other side, which was pulling you more in the direction of going into factory work, or getting rid of the idea of actually going to school, going to college.
I'm glad you asked me that, because I have to explain that a bit. There was never any influence on the part of my parents for me to go into the factory. Never was a word said about that. There was no inclination of that at all. I think my parents were a little bit flabbergasted by me. They didn't know. I was a queer sort of person, I suppose. Queer in the old-fashioned sense, that is. I was a bookworm. People, even when I was small, used to call me the little professor. That was a nickname the neighbors would give me, because I always had my nose in a book. I read and read everything there was. As I think I mentioned, I went to the public library every Saturday. I took out the maximum number of books. The librarians knew me, they liked me, they recommended books. I went back the next Saturday and returned them and took out more. I think I must have read every book in the children's library there was. So my parents didn't know what to make of me, really. This is a strange sort of person. I had a sister 5 years younger who wasn't in the least interested in books. I remember, for example, I tried to get my sister interested in books. There was a movie playing called Captains Courageous by Robert Louis Stevenson, a very famous novel and a very famous movie. And I took her on a Saturday to see it. I took her by the hand. Come on, I want you to see this picture, Captains Courageous. And we saw it together. And then we went to the bookstore, and I bought the book, Captains Courageous, though I couldn't afford it. I gave it to her to read, and I said, read this, Captain. No, she didn't read it, even after seeing the movie. So my sister wasn't interested in books at all. She's still living, as you know, 5 years younger than I am, living in Toledo, Ohio. And she's a very good person, but certainly not a bookish person. My parents were educated up to the 7th and 8th grade. They read newspapers, magazines, and so on. But if you look at the context of this was the Depression. This was the period when literally you didn't know where your next meal was coming from, where your next money was coming from. You didn't know what to expect. And so these were very precarious times. So they didn't quite know how to handle me, so to speak. And I felt sorry for them then, and I feel sorry for them now. They did their best. But they were not education-oriented, but on the other hand, they didn't want me to go to a factory. They never objected to my going to college. Never objected. They helped me with respect to going to graduate school as much as they could. They didn't want me to go to Columbia that summer because they needed the money, but they didn't object very strenuously after that. So I just want to put it in proper perspective that they did their best. They did their best under the circumstances, and they ultimately were very proud of me.
You think they understood what it meant to have a PhD or to be in that world?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so, no. I don't think they did. To them, being a doctor meant being a medical doctor, or a dentist, because my uncle was a dentist. No, but ultimately they knew. And ultimately they visited us at Kenyon College. They visited us at Syracuse University. They visited us in Washington, D.C. After my father was able to do these things, when he owned a factory, he could take some time off. So I don't want to leave the impression that they were antagonistic at all, or that they put any pressure on me to work in a factory. I think secretly they hoped I wouldn't have to work in a factory, but frankly they didn't know what to expect. They didn't know what to expect. That's the point. Every penny counted. And these were difficult days, and I don't know how my mother was able to get us through it. We never realized that after all we still had 2 cars. We still lived in a very fine neighborhood. But things were difficult nevertheless. My mother used to send me to the store to buy 25 cents worth of lean stew meat. Almost every week I'd go to the store and I'd ask the butcher, 25 cents worth of lean stew meat. And with that lean stew meat, she would make a stew. And that's what we would have for dinner. But that's how things were. Do you have anything else? Any other question?
Well, you said that you in 7th and 8th grade you went to the movies with the who was it, the
Priscilla Ives was her
Priscilla
name.
Ives, that's right.
Was a relative of this Charles Ives, whose letters are in this book.
Was that sort of like the first date or the first dating experience?
It was, yes, it was more or less, and that was only in 8th grade. Yeah, it was harmless. It was nothing sensuous about it at all. Just go to movies with somebody else, and that is a thrill in and of itself. Just buying her ticket for 10 cents. For 10 cents. Life was very simple in those days.
Did you have friends where you would talk about, which maybe that you wanted to ask Priscilla Ives out to the movie, or you didn't try to put your arm around her in the movie theater or anything like that?
No, I did not. Some boys did, but no. No, no, that didn't happen. And there was no talk, I know what you're getting at, there was no talk, so-called locker room talk. You see, I wasn't one of the locker room boys, so to speak. I just wasn't that type. I didn't have that kind of friends. My closest friend at the time was, actually he was an illegitimate child. That is to say, he was born when his parents weren't married. In those days we call them illegitimate. That's not the case anymore. He was a very nice fellow, and he and I were very close friends. He didn't have any religion, and I persuaded him to join the Catholic Church, which is interesting. He joined the Catholic Church and he became a priest. He was my closest friend. He joined the Order of the Holy Cross out at Notre Dame. And he died about 2 years ago. We talked on the phone just before he died. He was my closest friend, and he became a Catholic priest.
That was your closest friend in that period of time, 7th, 8th
Yeah,
grade?
well, that's right. And I didn't have any friend after that. A bit of weight. I don't know whether you noticed that. His face was thinned out and so on.
Yeah, I've never seen him except for on commercials.
Well, that's what I mean, his commercials, but
Oh, on his...
his face had thinned out. I don't know whether the same thing happened to his daughter and his wife, for I never saw them. He created quite a stir because he gave all the money, you know, for the Fuqua School of Business, several millions of dollars. And then in addition built this residential hall for the executive training program, which is called the David Thomas Center. So he's a very well thought of man at Duke. These are good.
We've got another one here that we can split or give to Lucy if she comes down. Well, I didn't get a microphone yet.
Oh, did you go? Mm-hmm.
I didn't.
Oh, you did not
But
go.
still thinking of it. I'm
It's
not
all right.
sure how the... I listened to it and you can... The sound is definitely there. It's on there.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a little bit distant. I mean, I tried a few tricks last time, like, you know, angling this so that and closing this to try and keep as much sound in as possible, but best thing would be to get a microphone.
Is it recording now? I hope not.
Let's see. No, but I wanted to test it. Let's see.
This is testing it. Abracadabra. Any Pamelandus. Euripides, Eumenides.
Alright, let's see. Actually, what did we do with the light last time? We put it right here, right?
Yeah.
Give that a shot.
I was going to offer you lunch today. We have rye bread and cheeses.
Alright, let me look. Let's see how this